our duty to think about what's happening after we're gone. And I know everyone will know the adage of, we have not received the earth from our grandparents, but we are merely stewards of it for our grandchildren. And sometimes that sounds like a placative thing. You just say it, you toss it out there, but really it's quite a powerful statement, isn't it? I mean, we are here as stewards, and decisions we make need to be taken with the duty of the responsibility that we owe. So today we're here to talk with a very interesting, innovative, distinguished panelists who are sharing their thoughts and ideas on how the just transition and climate action are imperative and how they tie in future generations thinking into their work. So from the policy side, to the legal side, to the action side, to private sector side, to just being innovative in how you approach the question. So I think you're in for some good ideas, some interesting highlights and insights, and I hope that you come with some questions, and don't be afraid to ask questions. This is really a conversation. We've prepared the groundwork for some good ideas to be trickling through, and then I hope that you all will come and share some of your thoughts as well. The session will go this way. We will do the panel discussion first. We also have a couple of people online. We have a welcome video from someone who's worked on future generations for quite a long while. And we are actually co-moderating today, myself and Nikki Reisch, who is here as well. She'll introduce herself in just a bit because we'll hand over. And then please save your questions then for the end, note them down, and then you will have a chance to be part of this conversation too. So I think for now, why don't we cue up our video, please? We have our co-founder of the World Future Council. His name is Herbert Girardet, and he is going to share just a little bit of an inspirational message for us on why future generations are important. The video? You don't have the video? Oh, they don't have the video. Okay, well, maybe we'll get the video then by the end. Okay, then let's dive straight in. So I have brought with me today some speakers from kind of the World Future Council universe. So we have Dr. Margareta here. You'll say your last name because I'm very terrible.
It's Janik.
There we go. And Marie-Claire Graaf, who's here representing the youth voice and the younger generation and then the energy makers of today. And I think I will turn to you, Marie-Claire, first. Please welcome and tell us who you are, and happy to hear what you have to say.
Just quickly, like the slides.
While you're introducing, I will find.
We will find the slides. Yeah. Okay, fantastic. Yes, my name is Marie-Claire, and I have been engaging in the climate space for quite a while. Because I come from a beautiful mountainous country of Switzerland, and there you see the effects of the climate crisis very forcefully. You see specifically the glaciers, how they're melting. On the presentation, you will also see a couple of pictures where you basically see where the glacier was when I was born and where it's today. And for me, the glacier are also a connection to the future generations, because the glacier have been here the generations before, and they should remain for the generations to come. Yet, due to our actions today, future generations might not see many of the glaciers anymore. There are glaciers which already are declared dead, meaning that the future generation will have no more seen these glaciers. So that's for me a symbol of sadness and frustration, but also a symbol of hope and motivation, because it's a very, very clear indicator. There is no way they are gonna just stop or gonna continue. So it's just happening in front of our eyes and everyone can see it. So this really led to a lot of reflection when I was like around 6 years old, and I was like, okay, what can I do? And then you start, with all these small things in your life, with like showering less water, or like, turning off the light. And at one point you realize, well, it's not really going to stop the melting of the glaciers, but it's still important. So I started to engage more on the political side, because I was convinced that we need political frameworks which actually help us to live a sustainable lifestyle within the planetary boundaries, so the glaciers can actually be preserved for future generations. So I started on a local level with the university, then at one point national level, until I realized there is a whole international multilateral framework, which is actually quite crucial. And this is what then also brought me into this world, where we're also convening right now alongside the COP28. And my first experience was really overwhelming. I came here for like, okay, I'm going to tell what I have to say, and then everyone will listen, and then suddenly, something will happen. Well, it was not really that way. So it was a rather frustrating experience again, because young people were very often just treated as a token Like, okay, it's great that you're here, but we do business as usual anyways. And so I really had this kind of desire or this vision that we have more young people being engaged in decision-making processes, because we as young people are the closest generations in proximity to future generations. And that's why it's so important to have an intergenerational approach when we come to decision-making, and not just having young people there for the sake of having young people there, but actually have them on the table with the mandate to actually take the decisions. Because I do believe that we as young people actually have a lot of innovative and new ideas, which are actually very crucial to advance the decision making, in this case, the negotiation process here at the COP. So we were pushing for it, and then actually 2 years later, I got a phone call by the president of Switzerland to be part of the delegation. I was like, okay, that's quite strange, but then I initially rejected. Ultimately, I agreed. So I became a negotiator for the government of Switzerland at a very young age. I read all the documents you can potentially read. But again, when I was here, it was very, very challenging, as I was the only young person in the room. I was a minority. I was, for example, leading on technology negotiations. There were very little females in the room. There was no other young person in the room. So it was very hard for me to actually bring forward what I really believed in. And so I kind of had this idea of creating an academy to train young people for these negotiations, to really equip them with the skills, the knowledge, and the understanding that when we are actually entering these rooms and taking the seat on the table, that we actually deliver what we want to deliver for ourselves, but for our generation, but also for the future generations, the ones to come. So a couple of years or a couple of months later, actually, we set up the Youth Negotiators Academy, which is an academy to train young people from all around the world and kind of set up a structure to support them on their journey to represent their community, their countries, their generations, but again, also their future generations in their specific locations to be part of the decision making. And I'm very proud to say that this is the second cohort this year, and we have been training 175 young individuals from all around the world, particularly from countries which are very vulnerable to the climate crisis and the impact what we're already seeing today, but also the ones with very small delegations. Because if you have only 1 or 2 or 3 or 5 negotiators in a delegation, there is no way you can actually covering what's happening here. And it's so important that these voices, these ambitious voices, are heard everywhere in the negotiations. So we are training young people from all around the world to ensure that their voices are heard directly at the decision-making table. And I see that the presentation is up, but I think also my time is almost up, but I just want to show you the glacier. I just want to show you the glacier because I think it's quite impactful to see what's happening. So you will see the glacier in a couple of minutes or seconds. So, I mean, that's my story. That's where I come from. That's what I'm doing. And I'm very, very passionate to bring these diverse voices from all over the world into the decision-making processes, because I do believe that if the generations work together, we can actually achieve change. And we have already seen this, but we need all of us and many more to actually make this happen, because every generation has something very unique, and we cannot achieve it if we just leave half the world's population out, as well as future generations out of the decision making. You will see the glacier later.
Will we be able to see, or we're not sure?
Yes, you're gonna see it.
It's here. I'm waiting for the magic moment. So you should all know, actually, what I asked Marie-Claire is, I said, hey, would you be up to doing a Pecha? And I don't know if any of you know Pecha. Yeah? So it's when you do 20 slides for 20 seconds, and it actually advances behind you, and it makes a very nice visual accompaniment to a story, which leads to the storytelling aspect of what we wanted to do today. So yeah, we'll see, maybe it will work. Sometimes you have to be very flexible. So
now you got the story without images, but maybe we can just show some images afterwards while
yeah,
we're talking.
we will try. It's never a crisis, it's just a challenge.
Oh yeah, okay,
So,
fantastic.
yay.
Good. Also, some new people arrived. So maybe I can just show. I was talking about my motivation and why I engage in climate action, and why I believe we have to involve all the generations in decision-making processes. It's basically two memories. One is the glaciers. I come from the mountainous country of Switzerland, where the glaciers are rapidly declining, and some of the glaciers have already been declared dead because they are so small that there is no way they can actually recover. And the other one is I love diving. I love water in all its forms. But when I was diving and I saw these kind of pictures and I had this idea of what it means to dive, and then you're just there and you can dive for hours and you just don't even see fishes. It's just like all gray and dead. So these are kind of two memories which are very important, and they drive, this is kind of what gets me up every morning, that we can reverse some of the impacts we have left on the planet, so future generations can once again enjoy the beauty of the glaciers, but also underwater. But maybe I'm just handing over and then we can maybe advance the slides afterwards.
We can do that, yeah. Thank you. Welcome also to those who found your way here. We're glad you're here. We're looking today at future generations, of course, and the equitable, just transition from various aspects. We've just heard from Marie-Claire Graf, who's here from Switzerland, who's a youth activator, a youth negotiator, a real champion for climate activism. And so thank you for sharing. And now we're moving to a topic that you might at first glance say, oh, what's that got to do here? But Margareta is a master at working with data and making data relevant to decision-making, policymakers, to the climate discussion. And I love listening to her talk about this. So welcome, Margareta. And please, you introduce yourself again, the last name that I can never say.
Thank you. Thank you, Lena. My name is Margareta Janiak. Yes, the last name. It's different when you hear it. It's different when you see it spelled. So that's Hans Lena's difficulty. I'm managing partner with Horizon Group, and we work a lot with data also on sustainability. We actually work with two topics that are somehow contradictory. We work with data and we work with foresight. And our foresight work actually looks even 50 years into the future, so very relevant for the future generations as well. On the a few things. One that I wanted to highlight around, when you think about future generations, it's obviously a very difficult topic to put into practice. And I think the data can be the data and the foresight work, the research work is really important to support the decisions that are being taken by governments, because you cannot, I think, and by the way, fantastic presentation, fantastic pictures, and it's really interesting to see that. Maybe in addition to that, what's important to highlight, in Switzerland, you will lose the glaciers, but some countries, future generation will even lose the entire country. Yes. So this is still just the iceberg, the tip of the iceberg of the story, proverbial iceberg of the story that we see here. So it's very important to look at it, to look at which parts of the future generations will be affected, when, how, and to really have a clearer picture about the potential impact of the actions that we're having. And there's been a lot of modeling undertaken, but very few modeling exercises over the longer term, looking at the long-term impact of what we're doing now. And there's still a lot of uncertainty, and there's still a lot of lack of knowledge about what the impact, where is it going to be happening. What are going to be which parts of the populations are going to be impacted as well? Is it by gender or by income groups as well? So that's where I think the data and the understanding of impact of the actions that we're taking today comes in. And I think I'm a big fan actually of foresight exercises in this context as well, because I think foresight exercises allow to do exactly what you mentioned, to build a common understanding between the different generations about what the common future could look like, and project themselves and create a vision about a common future, because that's the part that's missing to a large extent. We actually, there's a real disconnect between the people who take the decision and the use, as you have very nicely laid out. But I think creating this joint vision across the generation, and I don't mean day-to-day intergenerational working so much, but I really mean creating a joint vision of where we're going to go with society, because there's a lot of trade-offs between the generations that we've never thought about, and that our societies and our political systems are also not built for. We generally do not think in our political decisions about the future generations. We have across both business and political spectrum, we have a time horizon of maybe 3 to 5 years, right? In the best case, sometimes it's even a quarter, or even a shorter time horizon. So I think the foresight exercises and just a joint, and mostly this can happen at the country level. So a joint understanding at the country level about what the joint future could look like, and how this could, how this impacts today's decision is really important. Some countries have actually installed this. So, Hungary many years ago had a commissioner for future generations, and all the laws had to go actually through this person and be approved. But even for that, you need to have a really good understanding of the impact in order to be able to approve a law or not. Because sometimes if there's a law about some kind of industry segment, you don't even know what the impact very often on the future generation could be. And on top of it, yes, young people are the closest we can get to future generations, but many of them don't even have a voice yet because some of them are not born. So I think these are very very important elements, and there are mechanisms to integrate the thinking about future generations. I love your academy. I love the fact that you need to train people, young people, to take a stronger leadership and to be able to voice those opinions, because there are so many barriers to integrating. When you look, we did a study on youth participation in the political spectrum. There's still a long way to go in terms of youth participations in parliaments, in business. In business, it's starting by having youth councils in some of the businesses, and the businesses are recognizing increasingly that this can be important. But it's also not yet about, it's about the youth, the youth as the consumer or as the future employee, rather than about the impact on the future generations. It's how the businesses are thinking about it. So I'll stop here, and we can get back maybe to some of those ideas later on.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I think both of you underscore that what we need is the opposite of short-termism, however you define the short term, a quarter, 5 years, 3 years, 10 years, but because we need to be thinking in tens of decades or even hundreds of decades, and that's important. So we're going to make a quick moderator switch. Nikki's coming to the stage now, and this is our fun structure of our session so that we can spread the experience and share the insights a little bit farther. So I'm handing over to Nikki.
Hello, good morning all. My name is Nikki Reisch. I'm the director of the Climate and Energy Program at the Center for International Environmental Law, and a huge thanks to the organizers for making this space and for all of you panelists here in the room and online and the participants. I will say I send regrets from my colleague Sebastian Doig, who would have been here with you, but was unable to come. So it's my pleasure to be here. I want to just start by saying a quick word. I'll say just a quick word about CIEL very briefly for those who might not know us, but the Center for International Environmental Law has been around for over 30 years, using the power of law to protect the environment, promote human rights, and ensure a just and sustainable society, really for present and future generations. And I think the topic of today's talk couldn't be more timely, really. We are facing in this particular year a once-in-a-generation window of opportunity to ensure that human rights frameworks can be used to protect the rights of future generations. We are looking ahead to, in 2024, the Summit of the Future at the United Nations, which has flagged intergenerational equity as a guiding principle, but there's lots of work that remains to be done to ensure that it's taken up in the work of that summit, and that it is really a human rights-based approach taken there. We also are witnessing and in the midst of a historic triptych of advisory opinions before 3 different international tribunals, the International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea, the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, and the International Court of Justice, about which we'll hear a bit more later. But these advisory opinions are addressing the responsibility of states in the face of the climate emergency and the consequences for the failure to live up to and fulfill those responsibilities. And the rights of future generations are ever present there, as they are in growing climate litigation around the world. We've seen countless cases, and just at the start of the COP here, we saw 2 important wins in Belgium and Germany. Climate cases are ratcheting up the ambition of climate action, and doing so not only to safeguard the rights of present generations, but of those to come, as we know that climate impacts are only intensifying. So we've seen also recommendations by the UN Special Rapporteur on human rights, many of the different special rapporteurs, as well as a reference to intergenerational equity and the rights of future generations in the most recent general comment of the Committee on the Rights of the Child, which is important, but we need to build on and strengthen this, and to get to the point that was made earlier, make it implementable, make it clear how we can realize and enforce these rights to ensure that climate action and other actions to address the polycrises we face of environment and human rights reflect the principles of intergenerational and intragenerational equity. And we'll talk about the fact that not addressing intragenerational equity risks entrenching and exacerbating or amplifying those inequities across generations. So I'm going to be introducing the first speaker who will join us online in just a moment. Ashfaq Khalfan, and he's going to be addressing the Maastricht Principles on the human rights of future generations. And just to say a word about those principles, they were adopted in February 2023 of this year and launched at the United Nations in July of this year. And they mark a really significant step towards promoting a more sustainable future. Nearly 60 leading legal and human rights experts, including several former and current special rapporteurs of the UN appointed by the Human Rights Council, endorse the set of principles, which really intend to serve, they are intended to clarify and crystallize the present state of international law. So describe what existing law, both international, regional, and domestic, already recognizes in terms of the rights of future generations. So this legally robust analysis and synthesis, relying on the practice of and work of scholars, is really important to the work of those of you in the room and the intended focus of this conference, and builds on really quite a lengthy process and hundreds of inputs. So without further ado, Ashfaq Khalfan is the Oxfam America's Director of Climate Justice. He was previously the director, I'm looking at the screen because he's going to be joining us online, I hope. In a moment, we'll see his face there. He was previously the Director of Law and Policy at Amnesty International, and prior to working at Amnesty, he headed the Right to Water program at the Center for Housing Rights and Evictions, and was a founding director of the Center for International Sustainable Development and Law, and is the chair of the board of CIEL. He was a member of the drafting group of the Maastricht Initiative on Extraterritorial Obligations that was referred to earlier in the area of economic, social, and cultural rights, and is currently a member of the drafting group of the Maastricht 4 Initiative on the human rights of future generations. So please, Ashfaq, please tell us more about these principles and how they relate to justice, climate justice, and equity today and into the future. Thank you.
Great. Hello, everyone, and thank you, Nikki. It's great to be here, and I'll dive straight into the principles with a. I think there was a reference earlier to 20 slides in 20 minutes, or in 20 seconds. I'm not going to do exactly that, but I will try and just go over these principles quite quickly. So I hope you can see yeah, you can, great. Okay, so what I'm going to do is a whistle-stop tour of the principles. I really highly recommend people read them. They'll be an invaluable resource in any work and any advocacy on the rights of future generations. So I'll put the website up there, very intuitive, rightsoffuturegenerations.org. So this is a presentation developed by myself and a colleague, Sandy Liebenberg. As you can see, the future generations is mentioned in a whole range of instruments, in the recognition of the right to healthy environment, in the request for the advisor opinion on the ICJ that I think Samuel will be speaking a bit more to. Just so you know, in the way we define future generations for the purposes of principles, we were looking at those people who do not yet exist. Therefore, people who are children and young people, we treated as a separate category, because a lot of people said, look, children, a lot of people from children's rights group movements said to us, we're not future generations, we're actually here. But what the principles do recognize that children and youth have a special role, in the sense that they're proximate to future generations and can, if they choose, they don't have to, but if they choose to, speak for future generations. So that's quite important as a matter of definition. The principles also deal with the issue of reproductive rights. There are concerns by some in the women's rights movement and the sexual and reproductive rights movement that future generations can be weaponized for challenging reproductive rights, and the principles address that. We talk about future generations being people who will be born, but it doesn't say that it imposes any obligation on any person to give birth to another, in line with human rights law. It's as Nikki mentioned, these principles aim to reflect existing law And so we do believe, based on analysis, that international law does recognize does provide for the future generations as rights, not as interests, not as only as principles, but that actually the present corpus of international human rights law does apply to future generations. And we have three reasons for saying that. One is that international law, international human rights law, there's no limit to people who are currently alive. That's based on the drafting history of the treaties, where the people negotiating them intended them to apply to future generations. Many treaty bodies, the bodies have a mandate to interpret the treaties, such as the Human Rights Committee for the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, do consider that they apply to future generations. And of course, the General Assembly and Human Rights Council declarations have recognized the rights of future generations. Then there's a whole area of international law that talks about responsibilities and principles towards future generations, treaties on biological diversity, desertification, world heritage, and many international court of justice judgments. If you take that and you read that together with human rights law, it makes it a bit clearer that we are talking about rights of future generations. The third is what's called general principles of law, which is a recognized way in which international law is formed. And so we looked at the fact that many countries have references to rights of future generations in the Constitution, 70, many more in national legislation. There's judicial recognition, and many indigenous peoples and religious traditions around the world do recognize rights of future generations. The next thing the principles does, taking that, it actually it shows how, it explains what the implications are for what the rights of future generations actually mean in practice. And they're very, very concrete. And so some of them talk about the fact that there have to be actual restrictions on activities by present generations. But of course, those restrictions on the rights of present generations must not impair the enjoyment of rights by present generations. Now that may seem contradictory, but if you distinguish between what people actually have a right to and things like convenience or luxury consumption, it makes it a bit clearer how you can balance the rights of present and future generations in a way which is equitable and recognize, as Nikki mentioned, intra-generational equity. So the obligations towards disadvantaged groups, developing countries, should and can be addressed together with the rights of future generations. And in fact, one of the points the principles makes is that existing discrimination, disadvantage must not be transmitted on to future generations. They need to be rectified now. So some of the key implications, what does it mean legally, practically? It talks about shifting the prohibition against shifting the burden of responding to present crisis to future generations, and also not according less value to future lives and rights than lives of present generations. A lot of current analyses, economic modeling, all of that does exactly that. It gives lower value to, or gives a sort of discount rate to future generations on the basis that, oh, they'll be able to fix things, technology will change, but that's problematic from a human rights perspective. The principles then explain obligations to protect, fulfill, and respect, so to not cause harm, protect to ensure that third parties don't cause harm, and to fulfill, to actually practically ensure these rights. So obligations to protect, for example, the obligation to phase out fossil fuels as quickly as possible, the need to address loss and damage, and then fulfill the things like recognition, taking positive steps to, for example, phase out unsustainable and consumption protection production patterns. Some of the other things the principles deals with are the right to participation, access to information, obligations beyond borders, all of which are fleshed out in the principles. And I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Shfaq. That's great. And hopefully you can stay with us for questions and discussion. That would be fantastic. Before I turn it over to our next speaker, I just wanted to underscore, I really commend everyone to take a look at the content of those principles. And there is a forthcoming commentary that will elaborate more on them. They're endorsed by over 50 international legal experts. And I think it was in the latest report of the UN Special Rapporteur on Climate Change, there was a specific reference and recommendation that these principles be integrated into the Summit of the Future and considered by the UN General Assembly. So they do provide, while a statement and a reflection of existing legal obligations, they do provide a foundation for strengthening both the commitments and the articulation of how those obligations are implemented. I wanted to turn now to the advisory proceedings that I mentioned, including the advisory proceedings, pending before the International Court of Justice as a result of great movement led by youth, led by governments in the Pacific Islands, Vanuatu, among others, that have turned to the world's highest court to address the world's biggest problem, and to think about to what extent the rights of future generations are at the core of those proceedings and the questions that the court will opine on, and why it's important for campaigners involved in these processes to address intergenerational justice as part of these processes, especially when we know present generations are suffering so much. So Samira Ben Ali is a youth climate justice advocate from the French island of Mayotte. She has studied rights of future generations, European and international environmental law, and is currently completing a degree, I believe, on ocean law. She works as the outreach and engagement coordinator for the World's Youth for Climate Justice campaign, which has done fantastic work. So it's really a pleasure to have you with us, and we look forward to hearing from you now. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the kind presentation and for the invitation. Building upon what has been said so far, the Maastricht Principles are really important principles that are giving a clear understanding and legal basis to the human rights of future generations. This document that has been created come at a really opportune moment because, as it has been said, there is like a wave of advisory opinion that are happening right now. We have seen that there were hearings at the International Tribunal of the Law of the Sea this summer. And then there will be the end of the submissions for the Inter-American Court of Human Rights for the advisory opinion will be happening on the 18th of December. And that particular advisory opinion also has a question on future generation. It asks the differentiated obligations of states in relation to the rights of children and new generation in light of climate emergency. With this particular matter, we hope that because the Inter-American Court is really progressive, we hope that they will give a really big understanding on the obligations of states when it comes to the right of future generation, so that this could give ambition to the courts, to the International Court of Justice to build upon this and to create an advisory opinion that will be really detailed and progressive. When it comes to the advisory opinion at the ICJ, it asks two questions, the second question having two parts. First, it asks the question of what are the legal obligations of states in regard to our human rights when they're affected by the climate system, with the effect that we have on the climate system, the adverse impact. On the second question, it asks the legal consequences of those obligations, not only for the small island states, but also for the future generation, which is the second part, and which is like the really most interesting question for us today. We decided to take upon this question because, as it has been said already, we are already starting to face the consequences of climate change, and we can start to feel the inequality of the lives of the people who have lived past us and even of present generations. To take my personal example, as it has been said, I come from Mayotte, which is a small island, and it has already started to be affected by climate change in the way that, for example, our oceans are starting to be depleted because actually we are surrounded by a double coral barrier. And now, because of the ocean acidification, we're starting to see that those coral barriers are starting to get bleached. And also we're seeing that we're in the middle of a water crisis in Mayotte. The rainfalls that were supposed to happen for 6 months in Mayotte and be able to replenish the water sources there have not been regular. And in the times that they are regular, they really come into a few days, and we are not able to keep that water for ourselves, and we are obligated to import water from abroad. And it costs, for example, for a pack of water, it costs 10 euros, which is enormous when it comes to our living costs. And Mayotte is a really poor department of France. It is the poorest department of France, actually. People do not have the means to offer that. So because we understand that inequality, me personally, that's why I decided to get involved in this, because we understand this inequality, we have a duty to speak on behalf of future generation, because we're closer to them. We will understand the scope of the adverse impact of climate change that they will have on their human right, not only on the right to water, but also the right to their livelihood, the right, for example, to a healthy environment that has been created really recently. We have the duty. With the second question, we said that we have the duty to preserve the earth. And this duty comes from the notion of equity. We have to be able to enjoy they have to be able to enjoy the same things that we do in the future. And they should not have the burden and the responsibility to take into account the actions of past and current generation. That is basically what we want to see in the advisory opinion on the second question that has been made at the International Court of Justice. And we also call, because I see that maybe there's like a lot of academics in this room, we also call upon the academics to continue on doing the research that on that particular matter, so that the judges can also build upon that to create the advisory opinion that will be really effective and detailed, so that we can use it in creation of policies, but also maybe in courts if it's needed, but we hope not.
What we have now is our panelists, they've shared their insights with you all, so I hope you've got some questions or some sharings that you'd also like to contribute to the discussion. In case that you didn't, we planned for that already, and we have a virtual fire starter, what we're calling her. Tatenda Mambui is online. She is the youth representative also from the World Future Council, and we lost her to Deloitte Sustainability Practice. But I asked her also to kind of listen in today, this morning, and then share the initial question to kind of get some fire in the room. So we'll turn over to Tatenda quickly.
Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you for the organizers for organizing this event. And indeed, we are living in a time where it's a time for action, and we need to make responses to climate change, legal responses now. And so as a student of law, originally I come from Kenya, though I migrated to Germany, but I am still a student of law. And as a youth representative who's been seeking timely responses to climate change, I have recently found myself drawn towards an argument which has been highlighted by Dr. Ashfaq on the first principle in relation to how we can utilize regulation and policy to advance the rights of future generations, for example, using the rights of a child. So just to give a brief introduction into my argument at the moment is that, for example, if we think about it, the most widely ratified treaty right now by 195 nations is the Convention of the Right of the Child. And its foundation premise is that the rights of the child need to ensure the rights of the child, we have to look into their best interests. And when we think about the best interests, we're referring to the decisions and the actions which prioritize their well-being and their rights. And this rights of the child can definitely be completely interlinked with protecting the rights of future generations in this regard, the intergenerational equity principle that we're well aware of. Indeed, as has previously been discussed in this panel and and as well in other panels, this concept of intergenerational equity is really not new. It's been there since it's been there in the Stockholm Principle, in Earth Life Johannesburg case, where they also brought out this concept of the right to benefit for present and future generations. Just as my esteemed colleague just now discussed about the request for the advisory opinion, this is also something which has been brought out by the submissions, where there's been a demand for a just balance between these needs of the present and future generations. So we need to think about how we link our current concepts so that we can use what we have as a legal community to advance the rights of intergenerational equity and the rights for future generations. Indeed, just to briefly also discuss how these rights are really interlinked. The rights of children, the rights of future generations are interlinked through sustainability, that's shared responsibility to create a world that respects the well-being of all individuals. And so we need to build on our existing agreement on aspects which already have consensus, which also can be now reflected in the future waves of climate litigation that are just arising, as well as Lena said, and now that I'm in the corporate world, some of the things which I have to take into consideration, or I'm thinking about, for example, in relation to the Maastricht Principles, is how exactly how do corporates implement robust human rights and due diligence processes which consider the impacts, the potential consequences for future generations? How do they do this? And are they using mitigating risks in their supply chains, in their product life cycles, in their stakeholder engagement? These are questions which we need to push as a legal community to ensure that we broaden our perspective and we found our arguments on something which is constructive. And so my first question to all the panelists to begin with, thank you so much for your input. It's been very, very great. The first step is for everyone generally, what steps can be taken to address the social and economic disparities during this transition to a more sustainable future, so that we can ensure that vulnerable and marginalized communities are not disproportionately affected. And in relation to, because we know we have to think about a participatory approach also for future generations. How do we have governance models, or what participatory governance models should we have to account for future generations? And maybe one more question before I pause it. How can we utilize education and awareness campaigns so that we can build a greater sense of intergenerational equity, so that we can foster collective commitment towards sustainability among our current and our future generations? Back to you.
Thank you so much. Sorry, I will go ahead just so I could pass the mic over, but just to say, maybe we'll turn it back to our panelists in the order in which you all intervene, to maybe take up any aspects of that question if you'd like, and we'll then add on questions from the audience as well. Great.
Yeah, thank you so much. I might respond to the governance related question, how to diversify as it fits well with what we're doing. As already mentioned, for us, it's very important that specifically also young people are part of decision-making processes, but it's not only being part, but actually also being well equipped, being well resourced, that actually we can thrive and we can actually change something. Because very often it's also, okay, we have a young person in delegation, but you're not talking about what the person is doing. Is the person even understanding what the negotiations are? I don't know who of you has actually been negotiating, for example, at the COP, but it's actually really, really complicated to understand the procedures, but understand also like when to intervene, how to intervene, what to intervene, the whole also like legal implications of the different wordings. So it can be really, really frustrating. So I think it's important that we are bringing in more diverse young people into the decision-making process. Yet I also think it's very important that then these young people are actually aware of the implications of thinking about future generations and have them in mind while taking decisions, because then we can not only bring in current young generations, but actually the thinking of the future generations into the room. And I do believe that this then can shift the modalities and the process in the negotiations. I also think it would be important to have kind of a reminder, you know, in the meetings or in the negotiations about future generations. It can be, for example, an empty chair or kind of just a mentioning in the beginning or the end, to really bring them like into the room and create the presence they deserve. in the rooms. And I know that some organizations have been doing this already, or also there's an NGO who has the mountains, for example, as part of their board members, and give the mountains also room to express themselves in these meetings. And I feel that this would be something which could be quite impactful in these negotiations here, but also in any other governance related models, to have young people, well trained, well equipped, also with the future kind of thinking, but then also create the room for the future generations to be directly present in the room.
Maybe one of the things that stuck with me when Ashak was talking is that he mentioned the indigenous people. And I think it's really interesting to look at how indigenous people look at the rights of future generations, because when you look at, I just know the examples from Canada, where people look 7 generations back and 7 generations forward, the indigenous communities, and they think about the impact of what they do on both, well, the respect with respect to the back, the ancestors, and then with respect to the generations to come, what the impact of their action could be. So 7 generations, obviously a very long time, and it requires a very stable world, right? But in a world where everything is changing, again, understanding and having principles, at least at the country level, so that we are able to implement some of those ideas at the country, because most of this implementation is going to be happening either at the international level, as you said, but a lot of it will be happening at the country level simply. And I think from a policy perspective, the judicial systems are mainly governed by country law. And none of the countries actually have in place the right structures in order to implement and to fully operationalize intergenerational thinking in their policies. There's some approaches that are very initial. As we said earlier, Hungary, Wales has some of those, some very, and some of the countries have it in the constitutions, have it in the principles, but operationalizing it is there's still a long way to go how we operationalize it, and how we also determine what the impact of some of the very micro measures at the industry level is on the future generation. Sometimes this is very difficult to do, and it has a huge impact, and we see it just a few generations afterwards, or a generation afterwards, or a few decades afterwards. So I think thinking about how we can implement and operationalize this better at the country level through political system, political representation as well, but also in the judicial systems of the countries, and what that exactly means. And part of this is also creating an intergenerational vision for the future. I think this is still missing in a number of countries, that as far as I know, it's still not, we're still too short term in our thinking there.
Can we turn to Ashfaq online if you're with us?
I'm here.
Great.
Okay. Yeah, there were some complex questions there. Yeah, so the first was about the dealing with issues of disadvantage and equity. I mean, that's particularly important in the climate context, who bears the burdens of the transition, the financial burdens. We can see, for example, I mean, we see that a lot of carbon pricing, a lot of carbon taxation is regressive. If it doesn't applies disproportionately, in terms of the incomes of lower income groups, for example, in France, that they've shown that. So that's something that has to be systematically taken into account in all of the carbon, both pricing, subsidies. If you look at a lot of the carbon measures that are taken from flat subsidies, in the US, there are fixed credits for electric cars which take no account of income, and so these are just small examples of how equity isn't really being taken into account in many of the measures that are being proposed. Second point was about, and Magdalena already spoke a bit about that in terms of participation mechanisms. The only thing I can add to that is that there's a range of options. So in addition to the idea of ombudsperson, they can be, for example, even designated seats in parliaments for future generations. They could even be tribunals or national human rights institutions who could be given that mandate. International law doesn't say what those mechanisms need to look like. But I think you could argue, and the principles, Maastricht Principles argue, that there has to be some form of the right to participation of future generations has to be fulfilled by governments, and so they do need to put in place a mechanism to do that. There were a few wrinkles, not wrinkles, or nuances that we added to that. One is you obviously need to take into account the fact that any representation of future generations has to be, diverse and include groups that are disadvantaged or who have experienced systemic discrimination. We really problematic in the name of, if in the name of protecting the rights of future generations, groups that have privileged access now then get to represent future generations. That's, I mean, it's something that one really needs to be alive to. Related to that, there are groups that that have already been established. Like, I mean, indigenous people already have that. Many of them already have that perspective, and so we would want indigenous peoples to represent the rights of future generations, not non-indigenous people representing the rights of future indigenous peoples, and also particularly recognizing the the role of children and youth groups who have who can speak for future generations should they wish to. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks so much. Well, Samira, please. Thank you.
Yes, to be able to answer that question really quickly, I will really focus on maybe bringing also equality into participation in the advisory opinion proceedings. Because what we have seen as we have been campaigning and interacting with country representatives is that there is inequality in the proceeding, in the sense that a lot of the most disadvantaged country that need to be part of this discussion to be able to put their voice on the table do not have the means to do so. They do not have the means to pay for the lawyers to be able to write their statement and describe what is happening for them. They do not have the means to be able to really also go to the Hague afterwards to participate in the oral representation. So one of the ways to deal with this inequality is already dealing with what is happening right now, giving the voice to people who can. Vanuatu, for example, has made a strategy to try to help those countries who are in need and also need to have their stories in front of the court there. So also another point that we wanted to show point is that civil society has been at the core of this movement of those advisory opinions, and they have been there since the beginning, in youth in particular. So there is also a need to make sure that those voices, this is not only a state kind of negotiation again, or where people will be only talking between themselves, but without hearing what started it all. So there's also need to be witness statements brought to the courts, and there's also in those witness statements a need for youth participation and for the stories to be heard too. That will be a way to deal also with that inequality, in particular in the advisory opinion.
Thanks so much for all of those really helpful, I think, remarks that, in fact, in my mind, I feel like the answers that you all just gave really reinforce how incredibly important it is to have youth at the table now in a meaningful, informed, and cogent way to inform decision-making, because I think those are some brilliant ideas about what it looks like to have effective participation and representation of future generations in active decision-making now. But we wanted to open it up in just a moment for questions from the floor. I just wanted to add one more thing, because I think there was a dimension of the questions posed at the outset around the responsibilities of business enterprises or corporations to take into consideration the rights of future generations and to think 7 generations ahead as well. And I want to underscore one thing, and that is that what we're seeing certainly unfold here at the COP is that many business enterprises are promoting approaches to climate action, false promises and solutions in the name of climate action that are in fact undermining ambition today and are shifting the burden onto the future. So the promotion of speculative and risky techno fixes rather than urgent action to address the drivers of the climate crisis, the things we know have brought us to the brink today, namely fossil fuels and ongoing agro-industrial deforestation, and that it's really about states holding corporations to account and to their duties and enforcing that through effective regulation that is in the interest not only of present but future generations. And so I think as we look at what's happening in these negotiations and as we look back to the national levels where enforcement of human rights obligations is happening not only through litigation but policymaking, we keep in mind that these dangerous distractions that promise future action to remove carbon from the atmosphere to make up for a failure to stop the drivers at their source today is a form of violation of the rights of future generations. It is not effectively taking the action that science shows is required and the justice demands in order for us to stave off climate catastrophe. So wanted to throw that into the room and welcome other thoughts, but really would love to open the floor up for questions, comments, and if people could please introduce themselves when they ask a question, that would be great. I think we have a roaming mic, so thanks.
Thank you. Camille Martini, PhD candidate in law at Laval University in Quebec and Aix-Marseille in France. So my takeaway today, and I thank you for that, is that there's a momentum in the recognition of those rights in policies and laws worldwide. So it's great to hear. I had a question about the judicial enforcement of those rights at the domestic level, because I feel when there's a violation of economic, social, and cultural rights, the first response is before domestic courts. And I feel also that there's the struggle to recognize and enforce the rights of future generations before domestic courts, because I'm not sure who would be responsible for bringing those claims in case of violations. So and I don't think we should expect too much from the international judicial arena at the domestic level, like, because it's really procedural laws that govern proceedings at the domestic level. So in very short answers, what do you think would be the response to bridge that gap, or strategies that we could enforce to help those rights being recognized domestically in local proceedings? Thank you very much.
Thanks for that question. I don't know, should we take a couple, or I don't know if there are others in the room, just to put a few questions on there, and maybe if hopefully our panelists online and in the room are taking some note, we'll try to remind you, as I think there may be a rich array of responses. Thanks.
Hi, my name's Gabriella. I'm a JD PhD candidate at Duke University, and mine's just a quick follow-on because I was wondering if you could also add any examples of states that you see that are already carrying these out well, or especially poorly. Like, where should we look to and where should we put pressure?
Maybe we'll take a third one before we go back to the panelists. Thanks.
Thank you. I'm Marie Bierman, World Future Council, and we've been advocating for the rights of future generations for a long time. And right now, actually on all levels for ombudspersons. And right now with the Summit of the Future, we are advocating for the special UN envoy on future generations. And my question would be what are your thoughts on that? And what would you wish this institution should look like to be powerful? Thank you.
Great. I don't know. I was going to maybe propose to go in reverse order this time, just to switch it up, if that feels okay. If you're okay to go first, Samira, and then so I think in no comprehensive fashion, the questions had to do with the challenge of enforcement of the rights of future generations before domestic courts and the issue of standing, who can bring such claims at seeking enforcement. A question about examples of those states that are making progress in terms of protecting and enforcing the rights of future generations or intergenerational equity, and those that need to be pressured. And the third about what we think of the idea for a special envoy on future generations at the World Future. The World Summit on the Future. The World Future Council is doing a lot of work on the summit for the future. So over to you, Samira.
Yes, on the first question, it is quite hard actually, but for us to be able to bring this advisory opinion, if it's written, it will need to be as detailed and as ambitious as possible. And the one that should be able to bring this in front of the national courts, if it's possible, or national standings, I think that the youth will have a really interesting role to play in this, because building upon what has been said and the right of future generation, they could create the gaps and to be able to go further. And for the example of states that we should put pressure on, I feel like a lot of states from the global south have been really, at least in Latin America, have been really trying to push this forward. I'm thinking about Colombia, that has also, for example, made interesting and forward-thinking rights for right to healthy environment, that also try to include the right of future generations. Where we should put pressure on is I think the states that are part of the global north that could maybe try to hinder the process and be less advanced in their statements, and that also in the discussion that we have had are maybe also less likely to put youth voices forward. And for the last question, the summit of future and the youth envoy that will be sent there. One of the main things that I would like to recommend is really trying to train youth, because when I started in that space, going to different associations, starting with Jungo, starting with World for Climate Justice, one of the things that I really noticed is that we're quite lost actually in the negotiations rooms on what was happening most of the time. So this is really one of the main focus that should be done. And I think that you're also doing a really good job at that. So really trying to train and build upon the ones who are not able to normally be in those spaces and give them the opportunity to be there.
Thanks so much. Ashfaq, do you want to come in potentially on any of the questions, but in particular on the issue of the challenges of enforcement and standing, if that's something you might want to address?
I can, yeah. Right, in terms of who can bring cases, I think the two, I'm sure there are others, but the two key things that I would point to, one is you can have interested parties representing future generations. So the Philippines, the classical Manos Oposa case was, a lawyer bringing a claim on behalf of, affected young people and future generations. The other is, normally future generations are rarely affected themselves. But if you have cases by, say, indigenous people or children, they can talk about the harm to their rights as well as the rights of future generations. So you can potentially make it a bit real. So the people affected in the present, bringing to bear also the impacts on their descendants, or their people in a similar situation as them who are still to come. So those are two potentially overlapping different ways of bringing them. For the colleague from Laval, there's so much that needs to be done in terms of standing. I think there was a case even in your state in Quebec, where children were not able to bring a case on climate because the judge, you probably know this better than I do, but it was something like the class was too imprecise or something like that. So if we have barriers, even in regard to existing, children, the barriers for future generations are going to be even harder. So yeah, there's I think a lot of the conservatism is in the global north. We've seen a lot more creativity, as Samira mentioned, from India to Pakistan, Colombia, and so some of those examples of flexibility of standing need to be exported and taken up by others. One interesting example, I mean, Germany had the Neubar case, which is really interesting for everybody to look at, where they looked at the distribution of costs for dealing with the climate crisis between existing, like, older generations and younger generations, and that court case led to Germany having to strengthen its climate action in the present. They actually had to revise their budgets because of that. So that was quite interesting, and that was where that was not a future generations. That was between older and current living generations. But that sort of thinking could apply also similarly to future generations. In terms of the idea of a special envoy for future generations, just one point I'd say to that is that that would add enormously to what the existing special because at present we don't have a special rapporteur specifically for future generations. The existing special rapporteurs have been integrating the thinking, as Nikki mentioned, for example, climate, have been integrating the rights of future generations into their analysis. But it'd be really useful to have one role who's specifically looking at that, and ideally would be looking to provide value by pointing to the additional policy consequences, the additional things you need to do for future generations that are not being addressed by some of the existing mechanisms. Thank you.
Yes, reverse order. I think bringing the cases are very difficult. I think those cases are really difficult one. Operationalizing is really difficult because there is going to be a natural tendency to always prefer current generations, and this is just a human thing. There's still a lot of poverty in the world. There's still a lot of needs in the world that are unfulfilled. If you look already at the cross, we're not even able to do it at the international level for current generations. So how are we supposed to do for those who are not here yet, and who can be strong enough to speak on them? So I don't know who can be strong enough. I don't have an answer to the question. I think it's a really great idea, but it's going to be very difficult to operationalize it and moving really to a level where this has teeth and can bite, just because of human nature. And this case of France is a really interesting one. That there was a strong pushback from the people who are at the lower end of the income spectrum because they cannot afford it, and that's why much of the carbon pricing in France didn't go through. Examples of countries, I think countries that have less of a legacy of legal systems do better on this. So generally, that's a good moment to start thinking about this, right? So that's why it's much more interesting to think about the type of initiatives in the global south than in the global north. In the global north, it tends to be much more difficult because there's a lot of legacy in the systems that needs to be removed first. And but I think fundamentally it requires a lot of culture change and a lot of change in the way we think about our political systems as well, because it will not, it's going to be, again, very difficult to do it in a way that has real impact. That's me.
Yeah, maybe just to wrap up, I think I'm not the lawyer, so I'm not able to answer the questions directly, but there is one point about winning a case, and there is one point about the whole process of making a case. And there's a lot of communication. There can be a lot of ripple effects without actually winning the case ultimately. But this, again, that can create so many ripples. And I think what you and others also here in the room and around the world have been doing, I mean, it was a huge campaign. I mean, everyone was talking about it. Everyone kind of hyped up by it, right? And it created a momentum. Without that, the case was won, or like there was like something to come out yet. But I think this is already like so powerful, and I feel that we should not only think about the end, but also the means of getting there. And I think there's a lot we can really get out of it. But again, I'm not a lawyer, so I cannot answer the question. In regards to the future generations envoy, I think what is really important is that this envoy is not squeezed into the structure of the current UN, because everyone who is kind of engaged in the UN points out that the structures are not fit for purpose. I mean, it's horrendous that we have like a convention dealing with climate, but then it's not connected to the rest. And then others are talking in New York about it. I mean, it is a history, right? And it grew out of a momentum. And I mean, we have to understand the history. But if we bring in specifically an envoy for future generations, this envoy would need to be able to be outside or above or below, I don't know like where to place it, this structure to be able to actually then use it as a whole and not just kind of sit under a specific something and then be dealing, you know, through a hierarchy of procedures. I mean, then it's the whole purpose of it is lost, right? So I think we need to be placed at the right point, and it needs to be having, there's I think a challenge with the invoice that invoice is more often an advisory opinion and can allude to points. And I feel it would be very important to see how it can have given political weight, more than just kind of the token envoy who is speaking. We had this as a youth, right? And I mean, the youth envoy, they were like invited to speak and on a panel and a talk of youth involvement, doing campaigns, but then actually they were not able to demand that young people, for example, would need to be part of the decision making and needed other people, like for example, our academy and other projects who then actually brought in young people. And I feel that it would be good to reflect on some of the learnings from the youth envoy, because the challenges will be very, very similar. So we can address them upfront, or at least push for as far as possible upfront and use momentum of the Summit of the Future. And the year we have now ahead, or the 10 months we have ahead, to really build this political campaign to ensure that it's sitting on the right spot and it has the right political power to do so.
Thank you so much. I know we're coming up at time. The session ends at 40 past the hour here. Everything I understand in the schedule has been pushed. Do we have the video? It's here, right?
Is it on there? Yes, it's here. I just need your passport.
Okay. The youth have found the video. No, perhaps if that would be, I don't know how long it is, but that would be a great.
Very short.
Oh, great. That would be a wonderful thing to see before we close. And I'll use this moment to encourage you to consult the agenda for the next sessions. The concurrent sessions will begin right afterwards, I believe, and we'll go straight into those. So we're trying.
The video is found, but
well, perhaps, yeah, sure.
So, as we mentioned, our organization was founded by a number of did feel that the rights of future generations were meant to be included in decision-making, policy-making, legal procedures, etc. And it's a key tenet of our organization. And our founder, or co-founder, his name is Herbert Girardet. I asked him to just give us his thoughts very briefly on what that meant to him and why it was inspiring to him, and maybe what we could think about. So maybe it is a good thing to kind of walk away with the thoughts that he left for us. He wasn't able to come here, so that's why we're on video with him. And we've been playing some games with technology today, so I appreciate everyone's patience. It will work.
I think the internet is just very slow.
We're trying. Yeah.
What about if you send it to people to serve?
Yeah, I do apologize. After all the hype, I can't
Perhaps we
get
can
to
post
it.
somewhere.
That we can't do. Yeah, we'll make sure that we, excellent, thank you. Yeah, we'll make sure that we put it in, we get it attached to the recording of the session, if you wanted to have a look at what Herbert said. He's really a champion across generations and comes from a very strong place and a heartfelt place. So we'll make sure that if you want to, you can see it.
Great. I don't know, did you have one final thought or question you wanted to put into there? I think given that we are coming up at time, I don't want to make the folks late for the next sessions, but thank you all so much. I think this was a really rich conversation. I feel like many ideas and questions were put out, some beginnings of answers. And this is a really encouraging time where the state of both the law, legal developments, and recognition is moving quickly, not quickly enough, some might say, given the pace of accelerating climate change and damage. But I think that the engagements by a variety of organizations and movements and institutions around the world are helping to push the action that we need to protect this planet and its people today and tomorrow. So thank you all so much for your thoughts, and we really look forward to taking this conversation forward for the rest of the conference, but also outside these walls and halls in the work of the months and years to come. And we look eyes peeled for the decisions from the International Court of Justice and the other advisory opinions that are forthcoming, and how they will help ratchet up ambition and understanding of what existing law requires of states and corporations today. Thank you so much, and a big round of applause for all. And thank you, Ashfaq, if you're there, so much for joining us online. It was great to have you. Thank you. You know.